Usher and Neo brought up in the courtroom. We're diving into the connection these A-listers and music legends have to the now disgraced music mogul, and what the night in question that a witness claims they were in attendance for means to how this trial could play out. We're on the
Diddy just lost control. The courtroom was heavy with silence, the kind that presses down on your chest. As Usher walked up to the witness stand, nobody thought this moment would ever come. For years, whispers swirled in the background of the industry, rumors, speculation, carefully coded references in interviews that always seemed to stop just short of the truth. But now, in this courtroom, under oath, Usher was finally ready to break the silence.
10-year relationship that ended in 2018. Now here's a line in the transcript where Rashard said, quote, "I observed Cassie being attacked," and then, when asked who attacked Cassie, she answered, quote, "She was attacked by Sean Combs." In the incident in 2009 that Rashard talked about, she said she was recording music at Combs' LA home. Cassie was making eggs, and then Combs comes downstairs, quote, angry, and was saying where the expletive was his eggs. Excuse my language. And he was telling Cassie that she never gets anything right, where the expletive is his food, and he proceeded to come over to her, took the skillet with the eggs in it, and then tried to hit her over the head with it, and she fell to the ground. Rashard told prosecutors that she witnessed Diddy allegedly attack Cassie multiple times, physically beating her. And while she was a member of Diddy Dirty Money between 2009 and 2011, she said it was frequent that she would see these things. She said that Combs would, quote, punch her, choke her, drag her, slap her in the mouth. I saw him kick her, punch her in the stomach. Now, when it comes to Usher and Neo, their names are brought up related to an incident in 2010 that happened at a restaurant in California. Don Rashard was...
And when he did, he didn't just crack the surface, he detonated a bomb that threatened to shatter Diddy's entire empire. It started with his voice, calm but sharp, every syllable cutting through the tension. Usher didn't smile, didn't play the role of the charming superstar. He was there for something much heavier. He began recounting his early days, when he was still a teenager, just stepping into the world of fame. Back then, being under Diddy's wing was seen as a blessing, a golden ticket to superstardom. But as Usher told it, the reality was something far darker. He spoke of mentorship that wasn't mentorship at all. He painted scenes of late nights where the guidance quickly turned into something more sinister. The so-called opportunities that weren't opportunities, but traps. Usher described being placed in situations that no kid should have ever been exposed to, extravagant parties that blurred into chaos, hotel suites filled with behaviors that he said left scars long after. These weren't just wild nights. These were environments carefully controlled, manipulated, and disguised under the glittering surface of success.
Sensible joke while on tour, and I'd like to truly apologize from the bottom of my heart. This is according to the UK media outlet, The Metro. Now, the other name that Rashard mentioned was Jimmy Levine. He is a music legend. He is known as the co-founder of Interscope Records, so an incredibly powerful person in the music industry. It's important to note that in her testimony, Rashard did not specifically say that any of the three actually witnessed that alleged moment where Combs punched Ventura in the stomach, but she did say that they were allegedly there that night. Now, none of the three have released statements since their names were brought up in court. Combs is on trial. He's expected to be on trial for roughly 7 more weeks. He's charged with racketeering, sex trafficking by force, and transportation to engage in prosecution. He has pleaded not guilty. Joining us now once again to talk about this case is former prosecutor and criminal defense attorney Safa Robinson-Ferrer. Always great to have you on Law and Crime. Usher's name, he comes up yesterday, and that was kind of a moment where people clearly recognize who Don Rashard was talking about. What should we take away from that anecdote and the fact that Usher's name was brought up?
The fact that Usher's name was brought up, I think one of two things about it. On one hand, it's irrelevant. It doesn't go to prove or disprove whether Mr. Combs is guilty of the charges as alleged in the indictment. On the other hand, I do think that it provides background information that there were other individuals that could have possibly observed these alleged assaults or attacks on Ms. Ventura. Not only that, but if the government intends on establishing a timeline or a pattern of events with respect to Mr. Combs, his enterprise, and their dealings with individuals from the public or in the industry, it's good to note that the allegation, or at least the testimony, came in that Usher was involved with Mr. Combs early on in his career when he was approximately, I believe, 14 years of age, that he had gone to some sort of academy through Mr. Combs' enterprise or business. And the government can certainly use that to show a long pattern of behavior, dealings that he may have had with other individuals in the industry, and also to establish that Mr. Combs and Ms. Ventura had this long-standing relationship, that not only, there were a select few that got to observe, but that publicly some of these allegations or allegations of violence happened, and that other people observe those things.
And when we look at the transcript, and I have it here, and you have the defense asking why Richard did not talk previously in conversations with the government about Usher being there, Jimmy Levine, who's a famous producer, as well as the singer Neo.
The jury leaned in. Reporters scribbled furiously, and you could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on everyone in that room. Then it happened. Diddy snapped. His composure cracked wide open. He stood up in rage, shouting across the courtroom, his voice booming with anger as if sheer force could stop the testimony from continuing. Guards rushed forward. The judge pounded the gavel, demanding order. But the mask had slipped. The world saw not the polished mogul, but the man unraveling in real time. And Usher kept going. He described in detail how the lines between personal and professional blurred, how the promises of protection and guidance came with strings attached, strings that pulled him into spaces he never should have been in. He testified about the infamous hotel nights, situations dressed up as bonding or celebration but hiding darker intentions. He didn't stop at vague insinuations. He spoke directly about the manipulation, about the culture of silence, about the weight of carrying those memories while smiling for cameras.
That this enterprise engaged in a pattern of illegal acts. The indictment alleges Combs, quote, created a criminal enterprise whose members and associates engaged in and attempted to engage in, among other crimes, sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, obstruction of justice. And finally, there has to be the existence of a conspiracy, because the charge is actually racketeering conspiracy. So we're talking about an agreement between Combs and another or others to participate in this criminal enterprise with the intent to commit at least two of the so-called predicate crimes, the underlying offenses that form the basis of the racketeering charge. Again, kidnapping, sex trafficking, arson. Their central argument is that Combs, quote, used the Combs business, including certain employees, to carry out, facilitate, and cover up his abuse and commercial sex. So they claim that he used coercion, violence, threats of retaliation to manipulate women into participating in highly orchestrated sexual encounters, all while silencing potential witnesses. And also, it makes up the sex trafficking claims, too. And they point to allegations that Combs directed employees to stock hotel rooms with supplies for the so-called freak-offs, lubricants, drugs, baby oil, that they had to clean everything up afterwards. They also claim that he obtained controlled substances to keep victims compliant. So now we return to the central question here, the critical question. With all of this in mind, at this point in time, week 2, has the prosecution presented enough evidence to prove Sean Combs conspired to commit racketeering? And look, I know they have a lot more of a case, but at this point, have they proved it yet? Well, to help me answer that question, I'm going to bring in former federal prosecutor Nima Rahmani, who I love having on, his expert opinion. Who doesn't like to see Nima? I mean, honestly, who doesn't like to see Nima? So Nima, first of all, anything I missed about the definition of racketeering conspiracy? Did I hit it all, or anything you would add?
Jesse, love to be on, and you covered it. And, as prosecutors, former prosecutors, we love racketeering. And obviously we've seen it in other sex trafficking cases recently with R. Kelly and the NXIVM case. But even in non-mob, street gang, cartel cases, we're seeing prosecutors use it more and more. We saw it in the Trump-Fulton County case, for instance, because it allows prosecutors to bring in a lot of evidence and a lot of people into the criminal case and lean on them and flip on them. And of course, obviously federal racketeering carries a potential life sentence as well. But, going through the elements, like you said, first you need that criminal enterprise. And it doesn't have to be the mob. It doesn't have to be a rigid structure. It's a loose association of two or more people. That's enough, Jesse, for the criminal enterprise. You have that common scheme. And that's not really hard to prove, especially when someone is working for their boss, Sean Diddy Combs. Then you have the pattern of racketeering activity. And I think that's what people really care about. And I think what's really important about RICO in this case is there is a path for the government to get a RICO conviction, a racketeering conviction, even if they lose on sex trafficking, because there are other predicate offenses. So even if the jurors think that the freak-offs were consensual and there was no force or coercion, it still might get racketeering. That's why I think it's a very important charge.
Social media exploded instantly. Hashtags linking Usher's name to words like hashtag truth and hashtag bravery began trending. And Diddy's name? It was everywhere too, attached to terms like hashtag collapse, hashtag exposed, hashtag freak-offs. Fans who had once idolized their collaboration, their so-called brotherhood, were left shaken. This wasn't the story they thought they knew. For years, people had looked at Diddy and Usher's connection as one of mentorship and mutual success. But now, under oath, Usher was pulling the curtain back on a much more disturbing reality. Diddy's anger in court wasn't just about defending his reputation, it was the anger of a man watching years of control slip away. He had spent decades building walls of silence, NDAs, power, and influence, but with Usher speaking out, those walls cracked. Because if Usher, a global superstar in his own right, was willing to testify, who else might come next? Insiders, former employees, artists who had been silent out of fear. This was more than testimony, this was a dam breaking. And the industry felt it immediately. Behind
the defense is trying to draw this fine line between the physical violence, the domestic violence, and sex trafficking and assault.
But you believe that video is also evidence of a criminal enterprise too?
I do, because it was Cassie leaving a freak off, right? And she was forced to return to that hotel room. That's kidnapping. After the freak off, when hotel security came, that's when an attempted bribery occurred, right? There was potential obstruction of justice, witness intimidation. So Cassie wouldn't report the incident to law enforcement.
And sex trafficking allegations.
Of course, sex trafficking itself, no question. But aside from sex trafficking, that's what makes the statute so powerful and broad. Even if people do think that it was somehow consensual, I don't think Cassie was consenting to being kidnapped or being beaten or, the bribery or the obstruction. I think there's many different ways for the prosecution to win here with this RICO statute.
I have a lot more to get into, but real quick, do you think the jury's going to understand all this? And that's not a slight on their intelligence. This is a very, very, very complicated charge. I think that this whole case comes down to closing arguments, how the prosecution explains it, how the jury instructions lay it all out. I mean, am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. I think the number one question I've been getting, and I'm sure in the comments to this video is, well, yeah, there's domestic violence, there's maybe even rape, but what does any of this have to do with sex trafficking or racketeering? People think of sex trafficking like it's human trafficking, right? You're going to kidnap someone, lock them in a cage, and force them to have sex. Well, we know that that's not the definition of sex trafficking, right? It's just there's an interstate component, but there's sex with force, fraud, or coercion. I mean, as lawyers, we know that, right? Racketeering, again, you think of the mob, right? Someone shows up, knocks on your door and asks for protection money, right? Or they shake you down, or they rough you up. Again, not typically charged in these types of cases. But again, the federal government has limited jurisdiction, so we can't charge all these state crimes in federal court. But I think the prosecution in closing has to connect these dots and explain it. We know it, we see it, but I'm not sure the jurors do yet.
So moving on now to Dawn Richard, okay? So she testified that she saw Diddy try to hit Cassie with a skillet in 2009 before dragging her by her hair. And then in this separate incident, she said she saw him punch her at a dinner where other high-profile celebrities like Usher were supposedly. Cassie's ex-best friend testified that during a Jamaica vacation, she says she witnessed Diddy drag Cassie by her hair in the Hollywood Hills. She claims she saw him kick Cassie, and even most shockingly, maybe, Morgan revealed she too was allegedly physically assaulted by Combs, which we're going to get to too. But Nima, I want to start with this because the indictment lists assaulting victims as a pattern in the RICO description. You're right, it's not a predicate act, but it's a pattern of it. And would you say witnessing Combs allegedly punching and kicking Cassie during these various incidents, it helps transform what could be simply a pattern of domestic violence into a racketeering act?
I do, Jesse. Obviously, we have the pattern of violence, right?
Brands started making quiet phone calls, asking if contracts could be terminated. Labels whispered about severing ties before it was too late. Promoters who had once considered booking comeback tours were suddenly pulling out. not wanting their events to be remembered as the stage where Diddy's scandals overshadowed the music. Even collaborators began distancing themselves, wiping credits, scrubbing mentions, going radio silent. For fans, the fallout was emotional. People who had grown up idolizing Usher now saw him in a new light, as someone brave enough to stand up when it mattered most. Meanwhile, Diddy's once loyal base fractured. Some clung desperately to denial, insisting the story was exaggerated, but the footage of Diddy's courtroom meltdown told its own truth. You could see the fear in his eyes, the rage that comes when power doesn't work anymore. For the first time, he wasn't in control. And that was just the beginning. The silence after Usher's words was deafening. You could practically hear every breath in the courtroom as he paused, steadying himself before continuing, and when he did, he didn't hold back. Usher explained how, as a teenager, he had been thrown into a world far bigger than he was ready for. He spoke about being invited into Diddy's inner circle under the guise of mentorship.
Was being forced into this?
Yeah, it was a lot of graphic testimony. Sometimes I was inside the gallery blushing a little bit because it was just so detailed in the way that either the prosecution was asking the questions or even Xavier Donaldson asking the questions under the cross-examination. But as far as consent specifically goes, the Punisher, Sheree Hayes, essentially said that he didn't have a thought process on Cassie's level of enjoyment during all of this because they were kind of creating a scene, playing out this fantasy essentially. And then there was a point where an objection occurred after this was said. You could tell that it was a fetish thing. This is what Sheree Hayes had said while on the witness stand. And then there was an objection from the defense. And so that part was, I believe it was struck from the record. But as far as consent goes overall, he said that Cassie at points would wince and she would sigh at some of the responses, in response to some of the directions that were given by her husband or Diddy at the time, and that she was kind of seeking cues, and then another objection by the defense, but that objection was overruled. But so they were able to kind of get in that she was essentially seeking cues from the other man inside that room. That man now we know to be Diddy. And then even he was asked just about drug intake and drinking intake, or alcohol intake, I should say. And he said that he didn't see Diddy doing drugs or drinking during this. And I think the prosecution is trying to kind of drive the point that he wasn't under the influence of doing anything while this was kind of going down, that this was intentional and that type of thing. But then they kind of get into times where he was explaining, he being the Punisher, was explaining that he was experiencing anxiety performing essentially because there was another man in the room yelling directions, and to the point that he just felt like he couldn't necessarily perform because, again, another man in the room kind of making him nervous, kind of making him anxious. And so it was a lot of graphic testimony, some stuff that I just won't necessarily go into. But as far as whether or not Cassie was consenting to these activities, it seemed like from the Punisher standpoint that he sometimes couldn't gauge whether or not Cassie was really feeling it or whether or not she just was just taking direction by what he had thought to be her husband and that type of thing.
Fascinating discussion with, we knew that he might take the stand because Cassie had mentioned a Punisher last week. What happened on cross-examination? Specifically, wasn't he asked about a book that he wrote or something?
Well, I gotta say, despite having the name, an exotic dancer name, such as the Punisher, Sheree Hayes actually came off like a very nice guy while he was on the witness stand. He seemed very friendly. He was answering all the questions. If there was something that he didn't necessarily recall, he was very forthcoming about that. And so despite having kind of this aggressive name that he had used kind of as a nickname, you could say, just for his other life, that again, he appeared like a very nice man. But as far as the book goes, he had written a book just about kind of his encounters with Cassie and Diddy, but not necessarily naming their names in this book. But it was at least 6 pages in this book out of maybe an 150-page book. But this book was called In Search of Meat Freezer, an interesting book title. But it was essentially just about his problems performing, and just that he was talking about how he had gotten an implant for his genitalia during this. And so whenever he was examined by Xavier Donaldson, who did the cross, he was asked about this book. And so initially he was asked about, being the co-owner now of Hunkelmania, which is an exotic dancer service. And he now owns a website called getpunished.com. And this is something that he's been doing for about 30 years. And it was interesting because I made in my notes, Jesse, that Diddy was like nodding, and he was nodding his head, looking at his attorney. He was pulling up his chair pretty close at the defense table. Couldn't tell if he was trying to gauge the jury during this testimony. But Xavier Donaldson was like, so you believed Cassie felt comfortable with you. Did you have feelings for Cassie? You thought you were the only one doing this type of activity with Cassie. And I felt like the defense was kind of trying to do similar to what they had done with Daniel.
Only to realize that what he was really being pulled into was a lifestyle designed to blur boundaries, test limits, and create loyalty through compromise. He described moments where he felt trapped, where walking away didn't feel like an option because of what was at stake: his career, his future, his dreams. And then he dropped the revelation that shook the room. Usher testified that many of the so-called mentorship trips weren't about music at all. They were about power. They were about Diddy parading him through scenes where celebrity collided with decadence and danger, places where normal rules didn't apply, where cameras were banned, where silence was the price of admission. He described parties where excess was normalized, where young artists were introduced to a level of chaos that left them scarred, confused, and afraid to speak. That was when Diddy lost control again. He slammed his hand against the defense table, shouting, his voice cracking with a mix of rage and desperation. "This is lies. All lies," he bellowed. But the more he shouted, the more credibility Usher seemed to gain. The judge demanded silence. Guards restrained Diddy, and for a moment,
She went to South Africa to shoot a movie. And I remember them not being together while she was in South Africa. Now, when she was on the stand, Cassie testified that Combs was suspicious that she and Jordan might have had something going on the side, but says the details of how exactly he came to that conclusion were a bit fuzzy. Meaning this goes to a larger question. A, as the prosecution would assert, was this Sean Combs acting violent and controlling to force Cassandra Ventura into sex trafficking as part of a racketeering criminal enterprise? Or was he a jealous boyfriend and his anger is fueled by jealousy and insecurity, and there's love and there's anger like there is in any kind of relationship, not justifying it, but it's domestic violence, maybe a state crime, not a federal crime. So when you hear something about Michael B. Jordan, what do you take away from it?
I don't really know what Diddy's motives were. I think we're all still trying to figure that out. But I was very surprised at Michael B. Jordan. And on my radio show, I talked about that extensively. And I kind of gave some theories as to why he might be involved. Now we know Cassie had a flirtatious relationship with him.
Maybe, yeah.
But I don't know what the basis of the reaction from Combs is. It's to me, it's very puzzling. One of his bodyguards testified that he was in 5 different relationships. So there were 5 different women, and he almost had like a hierarchy to them, right? Kim Porter being his family, the number one. And then he said Cassie was moldable, so it's like, I think we're trying to understand the dynamics here. Was this love? Was this control? I don't know quite yet, but I do know that there's a possession there on behalf of Diddy, where he's trying to possess her and keep her from having these other relationships. He can have other relationships, but why is it that she can't? And that's really where I feel like the prosecution has an edge over it. Yeah. If this was a consensual relationship, she would be able to go off and date Michael B. Jordan and Kid Cudi, and the unnamed football player that we learned about. And she could have continued her relationship with Ryan Leslie, the producer. But the fact that there was a control element there where he's like, no, you can't do that. If you do that, I'm going to release your freak off tapes. Hey, because you've been, dating Kid Cudi, your mother has to give me $20,000 and take out a home equity loan to pay me so I can recoup my losses. That's the iffy part about that relationship. So there might be some love there, but I think that there's also some other very toxic behaviors and unfair behaviors on the behalf of Diddy, and some behaviors that really make it question if it's consensual. Because if it was consensual, she would have been able to see other people. If it was voyeurism, she would have been able to voyeur off on herself.
Media went into overdrive. Live bloggers inside the courtroom posted second-by-second updates. Diddy just exploded. Usher detailing shocking mentorship nights. Courtroom chaos as judge threatens to hold Diddy in contempt. Within minutes, clips of Diddy's outburst hit the internet, and fans began stitching Usher's testimony into timelines of old interviews and cryptic comments from other artists. Suddenly, Pieces of the puzzle began to align in ways that were too disturbing to ignore. The fallout was immediate. Major media outlets broke into regular programming to broadcast the testimony highlights. News tickers ran bold headlines: Usher exposes past with Diddy. Radio hosts debated the implications live on air. Podcasts uploaded emergency episodes. Within hours, this wasn't just a courtroom drama, it was a cultural reckoning. And Usher didn't stop there. He spoke about manipulation tactics, about how Diddy allegedly created an atmosphere where dependency was fostered, where saying no could mean exile, and saying yes meant complicity. He described the fear of being blacklisted, the whispered warnings from others in the industry: don't cross him, don't speak out. And now, years later, he was finally breaking that very silence. For Diddy, the unraveling was catastrophic. His empire wasn't just built on music, it was built on influence, on relationships, on branding deals that depended on his reputation as untouchable. But as Usher spoke, you could almost feel those foundations crumble in real time. Each revelation wasn't just damaging, it was devastating. Because the courtroom footage didn't lie. Diddy's loss of control, his visible panic, his desperate attempts to silence Usher, it all told a story that words alone couldn't. This wasn't the confident mogul. This wasn't the untouchable brand builder. This was a man